Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Willow Bay, Dean of the USC Annenberg School for Communication, and welcome to what I know is going to be a fantastic conversation today. It wasn't so long ago that we talked about the promise and the peril of the internet. Today, I think we understand with great specificity and no small measure of emotional intensity just what promise and peril looks like in 2020. As we sit here today, our connected devices are providing us a lifeline to necessary and vital work, school, information, but also to human connection. At the same time, we are tethered to these devices and the media they deliver, concerned about their impact on us as individuals and on society as a whole. And as one of the members of our audience in the chat offered, maybe we should be asking utopia or oblivion. So as we consider both the impact and the future of digital media, we have an incredible panel with us today, bringing together the perspectives of scholars and technologists, researchers, cybersecurity, policy, and legal expertise. So let me introduce them. Hani Farid, professor, UC Berkeley School of Information. Tristan Harris, co-founder and executive director of Center for Humane Technology. Karen Kornbluth, Senior Fellow and Director, Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And Niloufar Razi Howe, Senior Fellow, Cybersecurity Initiative, New American Foundation. Welcome to all of you. Great to have you with us. I'd like to begin by asking each of you a question that really situates within the context of your expertise where you think we are today. And Tristan, I think we'll start with you. You went from being an industry insider, a Google employee, a design ethicist, and now with The Social Dilemma, your hit documentary, you've been a very vocal critic of social media's hijacking of human attention. This is really in many ways a call to arms, a call to action, and certainly a powerful vehicle to increase public awareness. First and foremost, what do you want people to know and understand about today's digital media, but specifically today's social media?
Yeah, well, thank you, Willow. It's always good to see you here again. I think this is the third time we've done something together
Exactly.
at Milken. And, with the film The Social Dilemma, which just came out this last month on Netflix, which is really about sounding the alarm for the business model. I want to be really clear. I think we don't have to be against technology at all. What we really want to be against are business models that profit from the problem. And so a business model that profits off of engagement and human attention profits from conspiracy thinking, profits from personalizing us into separate, narrower and narrower echo chambers of reality, profits from addiction with teenage mental health, profits from sort of cyberbullying activity, profits from outrageification of our politics. And so I think what I really wanted people to get in the film is that, so long as we are the product, we the humans are the product, our behavior, our predictable behavior is the product, we're being domesticated into the kind of product that's most suited for these companies. So just like we take cows and we domesticate them to be, have the most milk and the most meat for us to consume, we humans, when we are the product, are most profitable when we are addicted, outraged, anxious, attention-seeking, polarized, and disinformed than if we're thriving citizens of a democracy. So what we really have to look at is the business model. And I think one of the things we're going to be talking about later, there's all sorts of policy changes that are always happening at the tech companies where they'll categorize some new piece of content as a kind of bad apple. And they'll take out the whack-a-mole stick and they'll whack the bad apple and say, look, we solved the problem, QAnon. Look, we solved the problem, flat earth conspiracy theories. Look, we solved the problem, Holocaust denial. But is the problem that these mysterious bad apples just showed up? Or is their intrinsic business model a bad apple farm, that their soil rewards unregulated virality, that the thing that keeps us so hooked is the promise that when you post something, no matter what it is, it can go viral in a heartbeat to hundreds of millions of people. That's the essential business proposition of these social media companies. And that is fundamentally misaligned with the cohesion of our society. Because right now, every problem in the world, whether it's inequality, poverty, racial justice, or climate change, are coordination problems. It requires us to come together and see the same reality and be able to come to agreement about what we want to do about it. if we live in a business model that profits by giving us each our own reality, that makes us more and more certain that we're right and the other side is wrong, but living on different facts, that's setting our societal IQ down to zero because we can't solve any of our core problems. And that's what I hope we get into later.
Tristan, thank you. And yes, we are going to talk more about the business model. Nilüfer, I'd like to turn to you. You've been a tech entrepreneur, you've been an investor, you've been an executive, you've been focused on cybersecurity. Tristan talked about cohesion and misalignments. How did the structure of the internet arrive at a place where for a couple $1,000s and some infrastructure, somebody can launch a disinformation campaign that does serious damage to a country, a superpower, no less?
Thank you, Willow. Well, if we look at how the internet came into being, we need to understand that the original vision of the internet was utopian. It was universal connectivity, universal interoperability. And as we rushed to operationalize every aspect of our lives in this domain, we didn't spend time thinking through the implications and especially the malfeasance that could take place. So here we are. We didn't predict how fast this technology would change our behavior as human beings. And the truth is, historically, we've had a lot of time to adapt to tech innovation. The first consequential invention that affected the communication medium was the printing press. We had 200 years to adapt to that globally. We had 200 years to adapt to the agricultural revolutions. We had 100 years to adapt to the industrial revolution. We had 70 years to adapt to the tech revolution of the early 20th century. But when we look at it today, we're out of time to adapt. The AI revolution, the genetics revolution, the energy revolution are all happening at the same time, following really quickly on the heels of the internet revolution of the 1990s. And the problem with this pace of change is that our civic institutions, our political processes, our legal and regulatory frameworks just don't have the agility it takes to thrive in this world. The other issue is that, as one of the audience members pointed out, is we assumed a world of tech utopianism, right? That the good that tech brings far outweighs the bad. And so when we initially designed the internet, we very purposefully did not build security. We didn't design in security because we wanted to enable rapid adoption of the technology. And we somehow assumed that either through self-regulation or a communal body that could set norms that the world would adhere to, that we would have sufficient protections in place. And I think David Bowie is probably the only person who pointed out the naivete of that assumption in the 1990s. Also, we didn't predict the categories of harm that could come from this new communication medium. So as we look at it, and as Tristan just said, from psychological harm to economic harm to national security to threatening the very foundations of democracy, not only can't our legal, regulatory, and political processes keep pace with the innovation, but we also can't keep pace with the creativity, the patience, and persistence of our adversaries and the miscreants in cyberspace who are motivated by some combination of lust, greed, and power to do us harm. Now, you layer on top of that some of the fact that Western liberal democracy is in a pretty fragile state, and the destabilizing economic trends that are taking place. And we have a tinderbox, right? We have massive income disparity going on. 70% of US households have had declining income over the past 15 years. And there was an Oxford University study that said 47% of jobs in the US are at risk for replacement or reduction by robotics and AI over the next 2 decades. And because of these economic disparities, we live in this angry world that feels disconnected from its government, discounted in its electoral process, disenchanted by the news media and its abdication of responsibility when it comes to reporting facts. And the world is just getting angrier. So now you layer on top of all of that this free and open internet, right? So what could go wrong? The internet's democratized communication. It's enabled universal connectivity. So now you have a situation where every device is a supercomputer that's aimed at your brain, and you don't have a chance against it. Every application is an attack vector that can be exploited by all manner of bad actors, including the tech platforms. And as Dan Greer, the father of cybersecurity, famously said, every sociopath is now your next door neighbor. So that's sort of the environment we live in. And the truth is that defense is a lot harder than offense in this world. Bad actors have an asymmetric advantage because they don't have to be right every time. Defenders, we have to be right every single time. The consequences for bad acts are pretty minor these days. We prosecute only a minor fraction of illegal activity, let alone shutting down hateful speech. And bad actors are crowdsourcing their capabilities, and they're reusing the same tools and techniques, so it doesn't take a whole lot of investment. In fact, the Russian disinformation influence campaign that targeted our last presidential election didn't take a whole lot of money to be pretty effective. So the sheer scale of the problem at this point is daunting. And even today, one of my colleagues at New America, he used Twitter's streaming API and found that on any given day, between 0.5% to 1.5% of all the tweets qualify as violent or hate speech, which equates to hundreds of millions of tweets a year that are encountered by hundreds of millions of users. And conspiracy theories have significantly more engagement than non-conspiracy theories. So, we have a structural problem from the way the internet came into existence and really not having anticipated where all of this would go and the uses that the internet would be put to.
All right. Thank you, Nilüfer. You talked about defense. Karen, let's talk about offense a little bit. You have a policy background involved in the early framework for the Clinton administration framework for the internet and developed policy in the Obama administration. How did we get to a place where these technological advances have outstripped our legal and policy guardrails? How did we lose control of the offense?
That's exactly right. That's a great question. And I so rarely get to be the optimist on a panel. So thank you, everybody, for giving me that opportunity. I do completely agree with what both previous speakers have said, that when the internet started out, there was this assumption that it was going to give voice to the voiceless and power to the powerless. And so the policy framework that was created really, was built around that assumption. And that what's happening now, what we've just seen in the last week with Facebook and YouTube finally coming out against Holocaust denial and against QAnon is an example, just as Tristan said, of whack-a-mole, and it's making us all feel exhausted. And it is the opposite of what we thought we were getting into with this wonderful new technology. But what I would say is that sense of exhaustion we have and hopelessness, is really not productive. We're running a real-time experiment on no regulation, no policy, not the right incentives for these companies. The experiment is not working. And so we just need to take a different approach. We just need to change the incentives, as Tristan was alluding. And I don't think that's impossible. And the reason I say that is because, as you alluded to, Willow, in the early days of the internet, there were a lot of policy decisions that were made. And while they haven't all turned out right, I think the fact that policy was so determinative should help us feel like we have agency to make new decisions and to change the way things are operating. So what do I mean? In the early days of the internet, there was a decision made to create competition for the underlying telephone network, to create competition for broadcast and cable. And so policies were made to allow the early internet to connect. There were decisions made that information should flow freely across the wires. So this Section 230 that's become infamous was put in place. A lot of policy decisions that determined what the internet was going to look like. If we want to change the policy framework, I think the first thing we need to do is say that some of the expectations that you have for fairness, for transparency and campaign donations, these kinds of things that we expect in the offline world, we should be able to expect the same things in the online world. And that means updating a lot of our frameworks. And there's a lot of common sense solutions that we can adopt that would make the information space a lot more like the physical space. But we need to realize that the internet is not a policy-free zone. It never has been, and it shouldn't be. And one of the things that always bothers me so much is when people look at these congressional hearings where they haul up the CEOs to Capitol Hill, and the members of Congress ask silly questions, and people say, well, it's hopeless. We can't do anything about policy because the members of Congress don't understand how Facebook works and they're still using AOL. And what I would say to that is that they don't know how aircraft engines work or how, the chemicals in drugs work either, but we can all agree on some goals, the kinds of goals that we're talking about here, and then we can hand it over to some experts and they can design some policies that just update our existing policies for this new world.
Karen, thank you, and I'm going to be asking you some more about some of those common sense solutions and what they might be in a little bit. Professor Fareed Hani, you bring to this a background in computer science, brain and cognitive sciences, information sciences, and you really believe social media has failed us. What does your work suggest about how we got here?
Yeah. So first of all, if you have not seen it, after this panel is over, go to Netflix and watch Tristan's movie. Social media. And then when you're done with that, if you are as outraged as I've been over the last decade, please go and delete your Facebook account, delete your Twitter account, and get off of social media. Not only will you be doing yourself mental health benefit, you'll be helping society and democracy. I essentially agree with almost everything everybody has said up until now. Let me just say a few words. I don't think this snuck up on us. I mean, it's one thing to say there are unexpected consequences from technology, but I don't think that's the issue. We can go back to the early 2000s at the birth of the modern internet that we know now. And I will tell you, having been there, that we had a phenomenal problem with, even then, almost 20 years ago, with horrific child sexual abuse material being produced and distributed online. Look, we can have a disagreement about speech. We can have a disagreement about conspiracies, but we can all get behind the content of 8-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 2-year-olds being sexually abused, that there is no room in our off or online world for that. And yet, there they were, the early giants of the technology sector saying, this isn't our problem. We are the wire. We just connect to people. And so this was not something that surprised us. This is something that has been long in coming. The problems have escalated from child sexual abuse to terrorism, to hate, to misinformation that is designed to sow civil unrest and create violence in societies and disrupt democracies, to sell illicit drugs that are killing tens of thousands of our citizens every year, to sell illegal weapons, to trade human beings. And this was foreseeable. And the problem has already been laid out. We have a business problem model. We have a lack of regulatory model. We have sheer and unadulterated greed from the corporate titans, and we have a lack of investment in the safeguards that we have known for almost 2 decades are in place. And I'm tired of hearing the argument as well, the internet is big, it is complicated. But as Karen just said, airplanes are complicated, pharmaceuticals are complicated, the finance sector is complicated, and yet we manage to with relative safety, run those types of platforms. So this idea that the internet should be immune from regulation, from policy, and from accountability, I think is long over. Frankly, it was long over 10 years ago. I think we have to do things at a regulatory front, we have to do things at a policy front, we have to do things at a technology front, and we have to do things at an education front. And the last thing I'll say on this, what is complicating all of this, is now a virtual monopoly of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Because if you want to have competition for a better business model, better privacy, better safety, better social responsibility, how do you do that when 3 companies dominate the space and squash any competition? So I think most of us agree on what the problem is. I think most of us agree that there are a number of different solutions that have to be put in place, but those each have to be pushed, I think, equally in all dimensions.
Let's talk a little bit about, and thank you to all of that, about text response. We've seen a flurry of activity really over this month, as you all have noted, policies on content, policies on advertising, and, most recently, there is some content moderation happening by social media. It happens to be content moderation of the New York Post. So weigh in, if you would, on, first of all, can and should we expect social media platforms to be policing themselves? Tristan, I'm going to start with you on that.
Well, watching their behavior over the last few years, it's always too little, too late. As much as we always like that they're stepping up and taking a bigger responsibility now than they have in the past. I often think recently of the metaphor of epidemiology because now with COVID, we're all very familiar with it. And essentially, we have kind of the reverse CDC. Instead of something that's trying to prevent mass infections of whether it's hate speech or conspiracy theories or these kinds of things, we have the maximum infection of other people because the whole premise is based on unregulated virality. And so, what much of what the platforms are doing is going from a position of we're not responsible, people just have to make their own choices. We're just handing out huge megaphones, or in the epidemiology example, huge infection vectors to like let people infect as many other people as possible. And it's up to you to get your own hazmat suit, let alone the fact that it just dumps all this digital fallout onto the balance sheets of society. But what we're starting to see now are very small moves. So people talk about circuit breakers. So Twitter, I think, is now asking, "Are you sure you want to share this?" If it knows that you haven't actually read the article, that's kind of like wearing an epistemic mask. So now it's sort of slowing down the rate of transmission of false information by educating each of us that there's actually more false information on there. That's kind of like dosing all of us with vitamin C, making us all more cynical consumers. I think we need to ask, what would make this entire ecosystem, more resilient, epistemically resilient to a corrupt information ecology? Because one thing that we talk about in the film The Social Dilemma is that this isn't just some recent thing where there's a few new bad apples, and if we could only get the perfect set of mallets to do the whack-a-mole on today's bad apples, we would have this perfect democracy that's functional again. The only way you fix a place where we have such low trust and so many problems is by actually rewinding the clock 10 years and saying we are now 10 years into society going through this mass warping of not staring in the mirror of social media, as technology companies will often claim, that we're just showing you a mirror to your society. So if you don't like the conspiracy theorists you're seeing in the mirror, we're really sorry to tell you those are just your conspiracy theorists. If you don't like the hate speech or the bullying or the discrimination, we're just holding up a mirror to that. As opposed to, they're actually holding up a funhouse mirror that intrinsically expands and rewards those actors who operate in those, let's call them less constrained or less ethically or just sort of thoughtfully regulated ways. And that's really the core problem, is that the entire system has been kind of rigged for this mass warping effect. And so one of the things that I'm excited about, less in terms of platforms' actions, even though they need to do a lot more, if I look at the growth rate of the harm, so addiction, mental health issues, conspiracy thinking, hate speech, and I look at the countries that they're operating in, the number of languages that they're operating. Facebook operates, for example, 80 elections, I believe, this year. So do you think that they have engineers on staff who speak the hundreds of different languages in, let's say, Ethiopia, where there's actually, that's sort of thought to be genocide number 2 after Myanmar was genocide number 1 happening on Facebook Watch? The growth rate of these harms is far outpacing the growth rate of product changes that we're seeing being made or legislative changes that we're seeing from government. So as those lines diverge, the thing that I'm not optimistic about, that I think that scales to the challenge, is really culture, that we need a cultural awakening, that we have been bombed by a business model. Like, this is sort of the Pearl Harbor attack on the United States of America and around the world, not by one bad actor, but by leaving the doors open to the mass corruption of our society. And that we need to kind of recognize what's happened to us and rewind the clock for a better time.
But I guess my question is the activity that we're seeing, however small and however it may be too late, a sign that cultural awakening is happening? Like, Karen, let me ask you, we've been asking for a while for social media companies to police content in some way, and now they are. So should this be considered progress?
It's a great question. And I guess what I would say is I would much rather they not that they would minimize the individual pieces of content that they need to look at, because they're starting the process much sooner, that they're making systemic changes so they don't wind up in this position behind the 8 ball. So what do I mean by that? We just released some research this week that showed that if you look at the outlets, the websites that are pretending to be news outlets, yet they violate all the traditional criteria that you would have for journalism. They repeatedly publish false content, for example, provably false content. These outlets have doubled their interactions online. Another set of outlets we looked at They don't gather and present information responsibly, violating basic journalistic standards. Those have increased their interactions online 300%. The platforms know who these outlets are, but they're generating enormous amounts of traffic. It would be so much easier for them to identify the repeat offenders, to look at the ones who are doing risky uh, uh, content that's going to cause harm and reduce the amplification so they're not spreading it virally. To look at some of the pages that are coordinating to promote some of this content, to look at some of the groups before there's a danger of harm. So, an example of where they waited way too late was in the fires in the Northwest. There was this rumor that was started in part thanks to some Russian outlets that Antifa had started the fires. And the local sheriff's office was being overwhelmed by 911 calls as a result, had to put out a statement. People were staying in their homes because they were afraid Antifa was going to steal their home. Militias finally were setting up checkpoints, not letting people leave because they wanted to check if they were Antifa. The FBI put out a statement. And then, only then, did Facebook say, we think there's a risk of imminent harm. So I think instead of waiting for that moment when things are controversial, they need to root out some of the supply chain of disinformation a lot sooner.
Right. So thanks, Karen, for that. So, honey, let me ask you, you talk a lot and study algorithmic amplification. Is it possible to do what Karen is suggesting when you're fighting against this algorithmic amplification?
Sure. So, to your question, by the way, I do think social media has gotten better, but there's a playbook that we see over and over again for 2 decades. You deny the problem exists. You admit that it exists, but it's smaller than people claim. You admit that the problem is there, but there's nothing you can do about it. And then eventually you get around to trying to actually solve the problem, but you do it sort of half-heartedly, and it's a one-off. You're not really creating systemic change. So now to your question, when Facebook and YouTube and the social media companies tell you how hard it is to deal with the massive amounts of data they have, would you please ask them, well, why is it then possible for you to profit to the tune of tens of billions of dollars doing fairly complex data analytics and highly targeted advertising and highly sophisticated inference about people's behavior? You can't have it both ways. You can't do very, very good data analytics to profit and then say there are no data analytics to minimize. There is absolutely mechanisms in place to make sure that viral content is not spreading before the harm is done. They have to do better on making sure that bad actors don't simply come back to the platform. The problem is these platforms don't have any friction in them. So bots can create accounts extremely easily, rapidly over and over again. You get kicked off the platform, come back again. So there's very little friction in the system. And when there's no friction in the system, it is harder to manage. So they could add friction. But the problem, of course, is that we are asking them to do things that are counter to their financial interests. As Karen just said, they profit when these things go viral and they get more and more engagement. That's the underlying business model. And so we are asking them to do things that are against their business interests. So to your question specifically, Willow, should we trust them? Absolutely not. There needs to be oversight to make sure that they are protecting societies and democracies and individuals, because the last 2 decades has shown that they're either incapable or unwilling to do it.
You're bringing me to a question that came in from the audience, which is a great question, which is a direct follow-up to you, honey. And I may have, anybody who wants to weigh in on this, please do, and I might have all of you weigh in on it. The question is from Ariel Yael. If standardized best practices, policies, and regulations were to be created and enforced across all platforms, whom should be entrusted to sit at the table, honey, to your point of lack of trust, and what should their priorities be?
Well, let me see if I can kick that off. So first of all, I think it's a great question. And one of the things that complicates the answer is that these are not U.S. companies, they're global companies. Mm-hmm. And we in the U.S. can't be making decisions for these companies that have an impact on 7 billion people around the world. So who do we need at the table? I want people who represent the free speech, open society, everything goes on the internet. I don't agree with that, but I think they should be at the table. I want smart lawyers. I want ethicists. I want policy people. I want technologists. I want human rights workers. I want the people who span the space of implications of social media to individuals, societies, and democracies. And that has to be a global effort. That can't just be a U.S. Effort.
Nilo, I think this brings us to you and your expertise because, you actually have experience with other countries working to, just as, for example, contain the spread of disinformation. So what do you know about the ways that other countries, sorry, I said companies, I meant countries, have worked effectively that might answer the question of who needs to be sitting at this table?
Well, I wish there was a silver bullet that we could point to in a country we could point to that has effectively stopped this. And I actually think as we look at it, I mean, essentially, and I agree, by the way, the documentary Social Dilemma is phenomenal. If you think about what's happening with social media as a public health crisis, you can look at how we've managed past public health crises, and they can be very instructive in how this could work. I mean, if you look at tobacco in the 1980s, when they tried to self-regulate to avoid litigation and to avoid regulation, it was a complete and utter disaster, right? What they ended up doing is launching programs in dozens of countries that were nominally about educating folks about the ills of tobacco, but what they actually did was use the most ineffective tactics possible and suppress the effective tactics. In fact, Philip Morris, horrifically convinced the California Department of Education to distribute tobacco-sponsored materials to California schools, which was nothing less than free advertising. And at the end of the day, when they evaluated all these programs that the industry used, they showed that not only did they not prevent smoking, but they actually encouraged smoking. So, self-regulation, I agree with Hani, absolutely doesn't work. And if you look at what the platforms have been doing, it's not sustained. It's after the fact. It's lacking urgency. And the wildfires is a great example of, trying to do something way after the fact. And as Hani said, it is simply not in their economic interest to self-regulate. Now, I do think because there's no silver bullet, it's more than regulation and policy here. I do think there's individual accountability. We need a whole of society response. And we have to, I mean, if you look at what worked, for example, with tobacco, it was explicit education about the hazards of smoking, including warning labels. It was regulating advertising and prohibiting advertising aimed at children. And it was taxing usage. And those three things are super interesting to me. So education is critical to all of this. If you look at what happened in Ukraine and how Ukrainians have gone up against Russian disinformation campaigns, they've developed, with an organization called IREX, a Learn to Discern program that the Ukrainian Ministry of Education uses to combat these campaigns. By the way, IREX is bringing those programs now to the US for teacher and school training programs. So education and individual accountability is critically part of this. Taxing usage to me is fascinating because what it implies in the context of social media is, we can't impose a cigarette tax, right? You can't just tax the user because essentially it's free right now. So it requires you to change the business model from an advertising business model to a fee-based revenue model as a way to tax the usage. And part of what we're trying to do is sort of tamp down the amount of crazy speech that's going up, and then how you control what's happening to our children. And Hani brought up a great example about child pornography. There is one agreed upon social norm online, which is that child pornography is bad. And when we can align around a social norm, we can develop policies, we can develop regulation. When we don't align around social norms, it's very hard for a regulatory process, for a political process to establish the right frameworks. Child pornography.
So, but Neela, let me ask you about that. How in the world at this moment do we think about establishing global norms, right? Norms that cross borders and cultures and business models and all of it.
So should I try that?
Go ahead, Karen, if you want. Sure.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that the U.S. did in the early days of the internet was we really led. So we developed a policy framework in the U.S., and then we sold it to Canada, and then we sold it to Europe, and through the OECD, where I was most recently the ambassador, through the OECD and through the WTO, we convinced other countries to come together. If we decide to take a policy approach to this, other countries won't take our policy framework cookie cutter approach, but they will learn from it and they will follow it. And I think it's really useful to think of two buckets of problems, maybe even three. But the first two are things that are not such a big First Amendment issue, such a big free expression is what you would say in the rest of the world problem. So what do I mean by that? A lot of what we see on the internet is manipulative. It's laundering content to make it more credible to users. So they think it's coming from a friend, but it's really coming from a bot. They think it's coming from a newspaper, but it's really coming from a content mill. Um, this kind of thing is classic consumer protection issue. We can update our consumer protection laws so that dark patterns are a consumer protection violation. Taking your data in tricky, hidden ways is a consumer protection violation. We can update our civil rights laws so that some of the same kinds of protections you can expect against discrimination offline, you can expect online. So if you're an African American woman and you need to be on Twitter to do your job, should it be okay that you can be harassed to the point where you can't be on Twitter without being threatened with murder? So update our civil rights laws. There's a great bill, a bipartisan bill in Congress called the Honest Ads Act, which would update our campaign finance laws for the internet. So there's a bunch of stuff we can do that's less of a free expression problem and more of just classic, let's realize that the internet is the real world. Let's update our protections in the offline world for the online world. Then there's another set of issues where it's much harder. It gets into a whole bunch of free expression issues. And there we sort of let the platforms do their content moderation on their own. And I think what some folks are starting to talk about, what Twitter is starting to model is, should there be some practices that we agree to, that we're transparent about ahead of time? So we're tying our hands a little bit when the real emergency comes. And should we say, it's not a question of it's going to cause violence tomorrow. It's not just a question of it's absolutely provably true, but this thing could be dangerous if it goes viral. So let's put in place some practices that will change that. And the industry can come together and agree to some of those practices with a little bit of concerted pressure, I think, from folks around the world. And the third bucket, I would just get at this idea of taxing. One of the problems with what goes on the internet is this vacuum has been left by journalism. Journalism has been absolutely decimated, in part because the ad revenue that supported them has moved to the platforms. And so I think what we need to think about is, could there be a tax on online ad revenue and creating some kind of support mechanism for real journalism, public interest journalism, journalism that's not only motivated by political ideology or immediate clicks. And I think that's something that we need to think really hard about. So I would look at those three different buckets and the U.S. playing more of a thought leadership role in the world.
Tristan, what is your take? You've spent a lot of time in Washington talking to folks. What is your take about some of the solutions that or suggestions that Karen is advancing? And, particularly this notion of getting the industry together to develop a set of practices that they all agree to.
Yeah, this is an incredibly difficult area. I appreciate the comments that have already been made, as well as the Nilu's comment about big tobacco. I think big tobacco is interesting to look at because it's a classic example as they were placing responsibility on the issue of the issue onto individuals. So saying they even created a fake lobbying group called Citizens for Fire Safety. So when actually apartments would burn down due to the fire on the cigarettes being there, they would blame it on the way that furniture was too flammable as opposed to the cigarette. It's a classic sort of shift of responsibility. A thing that has not been talked about yet is, I think there's a notion that what we need here is equivalent to the level of reform we had after the financial crisis. That if you said back in 2008, what is the one bill or one law or practice that's going to fix all of this? And the answer is we needed completely comprehensive financial reform, akin to the Basel III Accords and Dodd-Frank and things like this, to go from a comprehensively way over your skis, risk-creating, over-leveraged banks, selling junk as if it's real assets. All of those issues had to be dealt with as a collective. And I think similarly with technology, we have a comprehensively predatory, extractive, and fragility-creating tech environment. So an example of this, I think, is similar to how we regulate banks. So we say, okay, there's acceptable risk ratios around how over leveraged, how over your skis can you be in terms of lending money out if you're a bank. If you were lending out $1 trillion for every dollar that you had, we would call you an unsafe bank and we would shut you down. One way that I think about Facebook is that the premise of the automated business models that they operate on, what makes them so profitable is the fact that they don't have to hire any human editors who determine what's true or credible or real. They can just depend on the algorithms to sort it all for people as well. They don't have to pay journalists to create content because they dupe each of us into being narcissistic attention seekers, posting about stuff, which we'll do for free, and then they profit from that activity again using automation. The way that this nets out is that as we create things that create harm, they're lending out capacity of billions of items of content. So there are billions of items over their skis for every sort of one moderator that they might have speaking that language. So for example, you could imagine, just like we have safe operating thresholds for banks or for other kinds of industries, we could have unsafe operating ratios for virality. How viral should you be able to make your product? How quickly should something be able to spread? If we know that there are pathways by which very unsafe things that are literally leaving people to die are going viral at high rates, and then shutting down surface areas that have too high of a risk ratio. A clear example of this is when Facebook shut down trending topics. They used to have on the right hand side of the interface the hashtag trending topics of what things were trending the most. Within 2 days of having fired all the human editors and curators, I think 2 out of the 8 stories were actually both false trending topics. And instead of trying to fix it, they just realized they couldn't fix it. It was systemically gameable that bad actors could manipulate it. And so Sacha Baron Cohen and some others have been pushing this campaign for Twitter called Untrend October, where they just actually turn off these high risky interfaces, which are the equivalent of like these sections of a bank activity that are far too risky, and turn them off for sensitive periods. So before the election in all of October, turning off, say, YouTube recommendations, or turning off advertising for different parts of the services, or turning off trending topics. Certainly turning off suggested groups on Facebook. So the fact that why should we be having algorithms recommend QAnon groups to people by accident, which it's been doing in droves, again, for many years now, we should be turning off these high-risk surface areas. And so that's one aspect on the kind of financial crisis-like way to see it. The second way is that much like in the financial crisis where we had junk assets that we were selling as real assets, in this case, in the attention economy, we started running out of attention. So we started slicing people's attention into thinner and thinner fake slices. We had you pay attention to 3 things at once: your television screen, your tablet, and your phone. So now we've tripled the size of the attention economy, but the quality, the grade of that attention is junk. And we're selling that fake attention for fake clicks to bots, essentially fake users, for fake reporting to advertisers. Facebook actually overreported how many views there were of videos to advertisers by something like 900% in one study. And so much like in the financial crisis, I think we have a systemically fragile attention sort of ecosystem that has led to systemic fragility throughout the system. And the way to clean it up is by using this lens of what is fragile or harmful that's unsafe, and what is the acceptable operating threshold that we can do.
Mm-hmm. I like the turn it off model. Honey, I see you nodding. The turn it off model sounds like something right out of the dark ages, like when you had kids who watched too much television, and the very simple solution was take the remote control and turn it off. Honey, I noticed you nodding.
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think it's out of the dark ages, and here's why. When the Boeing 737 Maxes fell out of the sky, what did we do? We grounded every single plane around the world. When we found E. coli and romaine lettuce, what did we do? We pulled every single head of lettuce off of every store across the country overnight. When there are risks to society, whether they are physical products or not, we should respond. I think very few people doubt that social media has been weaponized against individuals, societies, and democracies. So here we are, 2 weeks up to a national election. So why not? Why not shut it down? Why not just say, for the 2 weeks before and the 72 hours after, we are concerned about how these platforms will be used to disrupt a national election. We're going to shut it down, and we are going to play it safe. Maybe we're overreacting. Okay, let's overreact. Let's play it safe. I don't think, by the way, we're overreacting. So I don't think it's draconian, and I don't think it's out of the dark ages. And by the way, there's a precedent because in Europe, in many countries in Western Europe, you are not allowed to have public on the airwaves discussion about elections a week or 2 weeks prior to the election. So there is precedent for this, and I advocate for this very strongly.
Okay, so we know that reports from Gallup and Knight say that 4 in 5 Americans are concerned that misinformation on social media is going to sway the outcome of 2020 presidential election. 80%.
Yeah.
Should that 80% be demanding that social media just turn it off? I mean, is that a solution?
I think it is. By the way, there's no reason why you can't do this other than they don't want to because they'll lose money. And the real reason is people will figure out their lives are better without social media. So the problem with taking an addictive, awful product away from people is that when people go through detox, they come out the other end. They're like, I'm not going back to that. But I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Talking about the election a little bit, if you don't mind, I'm going to stay on that topic a little bit. Nilüfer, what's going to be different this year from prior elections? What have we learned? And do 80% of us have real cause to be concerned?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I do think there's a way to control political speech and put controls around political speech versus all speech. And the problem with shutting it down is that you're not just shutting down political speech. You're shutting down all speech. And there's the First Amendment that we have to contend with. And since everyone's been using financial services industry as an example, I actually think the anti-money laundering scheme in the financial services industry is pretty instructive here, because there we as consumers, as bank account owners, very specifically trade off our privacy in order to prevent money laundering, right? The banks report on our activities that hit certain thresholds, but we're okay with that because there's a very direct benefit to us that is palpable. So I think part of the problem here is that people have to understand, and this is where education comes in, what the harms are. We need transparency, we need auditability, we need reporting. We need to establish standards for researchers to be able to access all the platform data and to expose it in order to get to a place where we can then shut it down and for people to believe that that's a good thing to happen. Now, for the election, what I'll tell you is, we know that 2016 was not a great year, and that there were effective influence operations that took place and widespread disinformation. In fact, between the two presidential elections and two presidential debates in 2016, The Atlantic reported that about a third of the pro-Trump tweets and about a fifth of the pro-Clinton tweets were generated by fake automated accounts. And in fact, USC did a study with Indiana University that showed there were about 48 million fake Twitter accounts. That's about somewhere between 9 and 15% of all active accounts didn't belong to real people. So
by the way, I'm interrupting. That's our professor, Emilio Ferrara. So
yes,
thank you for the shout out.
Exactly. And so we know that they're effective, they're cheap, and they're below the threshold of war. So we don't have great escalation policy to be able to retaliate against them. But what happened was with the midterms in 2018, the United States and the intelligence community specifically made it a top priority to stop that activity, specifically with respect to the Russians. The United States set up a special task force called the Russia Small Group, and it represented a pretty clear change in approach to how we did this. The Russia Small Group pulled experts from both NSA and U.S. Cyber Command to share indicators of compromise, to enable DHS to harden security of election infrastructure, and to enable FBI to bolster its efforts to counter foreign trolls on social media platforms. And it worked. In addition to all that, by the way, and General Nakasone, who heads NSA and Cyber Command, recently testified to Congress. The other thing they did, which was fascinating, is that they sent Cyber Command personnel on several forward hunt missions where foreign governments had invited them to search for malware on their networks. And thanks to those efforts, we were able to undermine efforts of the Russians and basically stop influence operations in the midterm elections. All of that and more continues to happen. Cyber Command is continuing to do that. In the last few days, we've seen a lot of headlines about both Cyber Command and Microsoft stopping TrickBot, which was an attempt to interfere with the elections. So there's no question that as a government, we're starting to organize. We're not going to take it lightly when foreign adversaries want to interfere with our most precious democratic process. With all that said, the key players are the social media platforms. And at the end of the day, without their full participation, whether it's voluntary or it's compelled, there's only so effective we can be. But 2016 is not going to be repeated. By the way, for 2020, it's not just Russia anymore. We have China, we have Iran, we have a whole bunch of actors that have learned the playbook and are trying to interfere. And I am incredibly proud of the work that the intelligence community is doing to stop them.
And are you confident that they will succeed in stopping malicious actors in the next couple weeks?
So the problem, what I'm speaking about is the foreign actors. So specifically the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. I am confident that we will be very effective against them, but we have a domestic problem as well. And it's
Yes,
a pretty
indeed.
big problem. And that domestic problem is not something that NSA and Cyber Command have any authority over.
There's a question coming in on the chat that I think I'm going to toss to maybe some combination of Karen and Tristan on this issue of sort of what should we do. What are the first steps leaders can take as the government and corporate governance aligns with human well-being? And that comes from Faye Feeney.
Well, one thing I just feel like I need to go back to our previous conversation. I don't think anybody meant this, but I want to stand up for internet freedom and not shutting down the internet. The U.S. sets an example for the rest of the world, and in a lot of the world, access to the internet means access to information. It means getting around censorship. It means getting around government surveillance. So, but I think you raised such an important point, which is we're not going to have it at inexcusable, huge amounts of risk. And so I think we have to think about how do we address the risk so that, we shouldn't be convinced that there's no way to have this wonderful jewel called the internet without all this harm. There has to be a way to mitigate the harm so that we can enjoy the benefits without risking our democracy.
Thank you. That's an important point because to your point, we were not suggesting shutting down free speech.
Right,
really
exactly. No, exactly. And so I do
turning off
think
your phone
that,
notification. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry. I think the issue of like who should be at the table is that sort of the question, Willow?
There was a question about who should be at the table. This one is more sort of what's the first step that leaders can take to make sure that governance is aligned with the well-being of humans.
Right. From my perspective, a lot of what we need to do is separate the folks who have a business model of getting more and more and more traffic with the people who are thinking about both the user and then separately, not just the individual user, but the democracy. And our old model in the world of journalism was journalists devised, to their great credit after World War II, this model of public interest journalism that was going to serve the greater good. And they were going to we're going to have a wall between the business side of journalism and the editorial side. But that was really unique at a unique time in our history. And where we are now, I think we really, we had a lot of newspapers, a lot of different outlets, and a lot of competition. I think in this environment, we really need to have some folks whose job it is to think about democracy and to think about making sure the user isn't manipulated and isn't discriminated against in the government, who need to be just, setting some basic ground rules. And then I think when the platforms devise their policies, it needs to be transparent. And somebody said this before, the word auditable. We can't be in this black box. We're all grappling for all these metaphors from other industries, and I like all of them. And I keep thinking about that black box after an airplane goes down. The people from the National Transportation Safety Board get to go and take that black box and find out what happened, why the crash happened, what were they saying in the cockpit. and then they do a report, they go back to the regulators and they say, here's what went wrong, here's what you need to fix. We have no insight into what's going on in these platforms. In 2016, the only reason we have all the data we do so that we know that the Russians were pitting one group against another is because the Senate Intelligence Committee demanded it and got it in that one instant. We're not going to get it again unless we have some transparency and auditability. And I think that's going to be a key part of making sure that the platforms are doing this kind of content moderation in a way that really reduces risks to society.
Is it clear that the future of digital media is a regulated one, given the climate right now?
Yeah,
Honey, you're
I would say so.
smiling.
Can I
Tristan, yeah, Tristan,
jump in
good.
after? Can I jump in after
Please.
Karen? So I think there's several different structures here. Justin Rosenstein, who's the inventor of the like button, who's in the film The Social Dilemma, has talked about instead of a board of directors, we need a board of the people. And these platforms really are taking over vital life support systems of democracy, whether it's our public square, really children's education. Parents are sitting their kids in front of YouTube, and YouTube's not hiring children's psychologists to sort of have it be designed for children. From every different life support system of democracy, they really are now infused with and have become the new social infrastructure of society. They are our new digital habitats. I think this has never been more clear in a coronavirus era, where we literally spend hours of time on our screens. So any way in which technology is not aligned with society is going to be felt to a greater degree. Almost like, you don't really care about ergonomics or a badly shaped chair if it's slightly misaligned, if you only sit in it for 10 minutes. But if you sit in it for 10 hours, any little misalignment, you're going to really notice. And so we're all really noticing the comprehensive misalignment of technology right now. So what could we have? We could have a board of the people instead of a board of directors, where the tech companies have to report to the people quarterly with transparency as just basic table stakes, where we, the people, get to say, okay, we care about addiction, we care about misinformation, we care about conspiracy theories. We get to define what the key problems are and get the measurements back from the companies. As everyone said here, we often don't get to find out about how big these problems are until too little too late. It would be like Facebook is both the Exxon of instead of oil, but of human anxiety. But instead of just being the extractive oil company, they also own all the observation satellites that measure how much methane and CO2 is out there. You can't have vertically integrated measurement of the problem where only you know, and you create the problem. That's totally not going to work. I wanted to say that Andrew Yang was the one candidate running for president who actually proposed an entire department of the attention economy at a federal level that could convene these kinds of civil society groups to come to the table together and say, what are the values that we care about and what are the quarterly metrics that we want to reduce? And then how do we actually do that proactively, not reactively? Because as Karen said, black boxes are wonderful in airplanes, but they happen after they crash. We are going through a democracy crash, and we don't want to have the black box just after this has all happened. And I think, as Nilo and I have both expressed, I think in a similar conference in the past, the sort of zooming out view here is the problem of humanity as we have, as E.O. Wilson said, Paleolithic emotions and brains, medieval institutions, and then accelerating godlike tech. And when you have accelerating godlike tech that's creating harms way faster than your medieval institutions are, using the steering wheel, you're going to crash if your steering wheel is lagging behind your accelerator. So we need a proactive steering wheel. We have to upgrade our medieval institutions, embrace our Paleolithic emotions and become self-aware of them, and then actually have the wisdom to wield more godlike technology. And I think that can be done a combination through sort of a federal government implementation combined with the board of the people that really have to speak, the people who are most harmed by these issues.
All right, this board of
Can I
people
add to
has,
that real quick?
you guys have a minute and a half left. Go for it.
Okay, let me add two things very quickly, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So first of all, I love listening to Tristan. I can listen to him all day long. He's terrific. So first of all, you can shut down Facebook and Twitter without violating our First Amendment rights. You don't have a First Amendment right and a freedom of speech to be on Facebook and Twitter. And I think doing so 72 hours before and after election is a modest step without infringing on our rights. And to your question, Willow, regulation is coming. We may disagree on why or what the form is, but it's coming in Europe, it's coming in UK, and it's going to come in the US. And it's just a question of whether we're going to do it in a smart way that is effective or do more harm than good.
Nilu, go for it.
Just really quickly, I was going to throw in another favorite Professor Wilson quote, which is, people would rather believe than to know. is one of the things he said. And that's one of the fundamental problems here is we need to teach people. They need to know. There needs to be transparency around what's going on, and education is a huge part of this. And I think with the polarized tribal society we live in, and the fact that whatever regulation we come up with has to be multilateral because this is a global commons, it's not just the US commons. I don't know how much faith everyone has in our ability to resolve these issues. And this is where I think individual accountability, responsibility, education just matters so much. And we can do that much faster than trying to get Congress to move or trying to get nations to come together. We have to do those as well. But education is 100% in our control.
I'll take it on that note. Education is in our control, and we're doing our best over here. Thank you all so very much. I'm really excited about next year's conversation with you all. And see where next year's talk takes us. Thank you, Hani Farid, Tristan Harris, Karen Kornbluf, and Neelafar Howe. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Willow.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Bye-bye.